Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brad Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. And I'd like to welcome all of you today to our John W. Pope Lecture Series. Before we begin, though, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank publicly the Pope Foundation of North Carolina for their generous support in funding today's event. Now, you should know that today's event is being filmed and will be posted on the Clemson Institute's website in a few days, and it is also being live streamed. At this time, I'd also like you to take this opportunity to turn off your cell phones, please. The Clemson Institute has been hosting the Pope Lecture Series now for 7 years, and today's event is, I think, particularly special. Our format is as follows. Our two guests will have a conversation on the question, was Jesus a socialist, for about 40 minutes. And my primary job today is essentially just to get out of the way, laissez-faire, and to serve essentially as a night watchman. We will then turn the floor over to our two inquisitors sitting down at the table here in the front, Dr. Bruce Yandel, Professor Emeritus of Economics from Clemson University, and Dr. Ben White, Assistant Professor in the Religion Department. They will have 10 or 15 minutes or so to ask a couple of questions each, and then we shall open the floor to all of you for an extended Q&A with our two guests. Now, I should say at the outset that when we do get to this general Q&A, I would please ask that you not make statements, but rather that you ask a direct question. And questions typically begin with what, why, or how. Now, this is going to be the longest introduction that I've ever delivered, and not simply because we have two guests with us, but rather because we have two remarkably distinguished visiting guests at Clemson today. Ron Sider, to my left, is Senior Distinguished Professor of Holistic Theology and of Public Policy at the Palmer Theological Seminary, and he is President Emeritus of Evangelicals for Social Action. He holds a PhD from Yale University. Professor Sider is an internationally known evangelical speaker and writer who has spoken on 6 continents and published more than 30 books. His best-known book is Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, which was recognized as one of the 100 most influential books of the 20th century. He's also authored many other books, including I Am Not a Social Activist, Just Politics, A Guide for Christian Engagement, Just Generosity, A New Vision for Overcoming Poverty in America. In 1982, the Christian Century named Ron Sider one of the 12 most influential persons in the field of religion in the United States. Professor Sider has lectured at scores of colleges and universities around the world, including Yale, Princeton, Harvard, and Oxford. Robert George, to my right, is McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. Last year, he was a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. Professor George received a doctorate in philosophy of law from Oxford University and a law degree from the Harvard Law School. He is also chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and he has served on the President's Council on Bioethics and is a presidential appointee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Professor George is the author or editor of numerous books in the fields of constitutional law, ethics, and political philosophy, including Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality, In Defense of Natural Law, What is Marriage, Conscience and Its Enemies, Confronting the Dogmas of Liberal Secularism. Professor George has also written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Times Literary Supplement. He is the recipient of the U.S. Presidential Citizens Medal and the honorific Medal for the Defense of Human Rights of the Republic of Poland, the Bradley Prize for Intellectual and Civic Engagement, and the Sidney Hook Memorial Award. He is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and in 1994, he was Counsel of Record to Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Gentlemen, it is a great honor and a pleasure to welcome you to Clemson University.
Thank you, Brad.
So, let's begin. Was Jesus a socialist? Obviously, the question is anachronistic. In the technical modern sense, there was no socialism, obviously, in the world of Jesus of Nazareth. For the purposes of this conversation, though, I'd like us to think about socialism not in a narrow political or economic context that is defined as the government ownership of the means of production, but rather in a broader moral and social context that is defined, say, as the equal distribution of economic resources. So here's my question to begin this conversation. What guidance does Christian moral teaching provide us today in the social, political, and economic realms? Do its tenets incline towards socialism or capitalism? Robbie, would you like to start?
Yes, let me begin by just tossing out a few points. Obviously, it's a question that could elicit from either of us an hour or two of commentary. I'll just throw out a few points and then turn it over to Ron. But before doing that, I want to thank you, Brad, and the Pope Foundation for the opportunity to be here. Professor Thompson and I got to be friends when he spent a year as my colleague at Princeton. And it was a wonderful year together, and it's great now to be able to visit him on his home turf. And what a joy, there's no other word for it, a joy to be with my dear old friend Ron Sider, whom I love and admire. Don't believe everything he says tonight, but he is a great man, a truly great man, from whom I've learned a lot about Jesus, who Jesus was and is. Here are my initial points. When we think about how we ought to behave toward other people, indeed how we ought to behave even in our self-regarding actions, to use a term associated with a very modern thinker, John Stuart Mill. The Christian tradition begins with the Jewish scripture. It begins at the beginning in Genesis 1 of the Bible, where we're told that the human being, man, although fashioned from the dust of the earth, is made in the very image and likeness of the divine ruler and creator of the universe. Bearing, we therefore cannot help but infer a profound, inherent, and equal dignity. A dignity that is such that it commands respect in all dimensions of our lives. A dignity that means we can never reduce one of us, no matter who he or she is, no matter how weak, how poor, how unfortunate, how silly. Can't reduce any one of us to a mere means to other ends. The human being is always the end toward which other things are means, other things including political systems, economic systems, legal systems, social orders. Now that's quite a remarkable teaching, and obviously not one that is shared by every tradition of thought or even every tradition of faith that is known to mankind. But it's the beginning of all Christian thought. Now there was a word that I used in describing this fundamental foundation of the Christian tradition when it comes to our thought about ethics, including political ethics and social ethics. There's a word that will have some resonance for our friends who are socialists, and that was the word equal. Do you remember what I said? That the human person, as made in the image and likeness of God, bears a profound, inherent, and equal dignity. Now that has led some in the Christian tradition in the direction of socialism, not only in the very broad sense that Professor Thompson suggested that we talk about today, but even in that narrower sense, the sense of the means of production being entirely in the hands of the state, the socialization of the means of production. And that, I think, is an error and a very fundamental error. It is by no means required. Indeed, I will later argue, once I've given Ron a chance to talk, I will later argue that it's actually inconsistent with the Christian view to suppose that the equality and dignity of human beings means that the state should own the means of production, that we should abolish private property, replace the market system of exchange with a command economy, or even that we should aim for, as if it were a value of intrinsic worth, the equal distribution of property or wealth more generally, or the equal distribution of income. None of that is required by Christian faith, and I think the effort to achieve those misguided goals would actually perversely undermine the dignity of the human being. The consequences for society would be very much the consequences that we've seen in socialist regimes. Much too often, economic stagnation, the general impoverishment and immiseration of the society, dependency, all the social pathologies that come with that, even the very unchristian attitude of envy of what other people have, despite the fact that they've worked hard, taken initiative, even taken risks to produce. Now finally, does that mean that I, as a Christian, or that I believe the Christian tradition embraces capitalism? If by capitalism we mean, and I don't think we should necessarily define it that way, but some do, if we mean the laissez-faire theory, the unbridled capitalism that leaves no role for government apart from that of what Brad called, referring to his own role in this evening's proceedings, the night watchman, the strict or extreme libertarian position. No, not at all. I don't embrace that at all. I do think that government has a significant and important role to play, not only in protecting public health, safety, and morals and advancing the common good generally in that way, but also in the prevention of exploitation and abuse, in providing for common need where individual initiative or the institutions of civil society have proven incapable, or under certain circumstances, such as emergency circumstances, earthquakes, hurricanes, and so forth, of providing for the needs of people who are hit hardest. I do think there's a legitimate role for government there. And I certainly don't mean, in rejecting socialism and embracing the idea of the dignity of the individual, I certainly don't mean to embrace the kind of individualism that supposes that our relationships with each other, from our ordinary friendships to our familial relationships or even the profound bond of marriage, have only instrumental value. That the value of our relationships consists only in enabling the individual partners in the relationship more efficiently or effectively to gain their own self-interested ends. I reject that, as any Christian must. Any Christian must affirm the value of sociability itself, seeing human relationships not merely as instrumentally good, but as having a profound inherent or intrinsic value. That human fulfillment exists in considerable part, although not exclusively, in the intrinsic relationship, the intrinsic value of the relationships that we form with each other, from those that are the most intense, those of marriage and family, to those that are much less intimate, but nevertheless are not merely instrumental. So there are a few remarks, Brad, just to open things up. Let me turn it over to Ron and we can go back and forth.
Well, if the question is Jesus a socialist, I suppose one could quote a famous person and say it all depends on the definition of is. But I'll go beyond that. I would just say that it's a privilege to be here at Clemson, and it's a delight to be with Robbie again. he's kind of stereotypically known as a conservative. I'm on socioeconomic issues. I'm stereotypically known as a liberal. But I've learned a great deal from him, and it's always a delight to talk with him. I would make a couple quick points. First of all, I try to find my basic normative vision for socioeconomic questions and public policy by going back to the biblical canon and not just pulling out a text here and there, but trying to see what the full sweep of the biblical canon is. And let me illustrate it with the question, what's my definition of economic justice? Well, I like to go back to the Old Testament and to the issue of the land. The land was divided. The government didn't own it all. A few wealthy people didn't own it all. Every family had their own land. And then in the time of the kings, the prophets shouted and screamed because a few powerful people around the king were seizing the land so that many of the poorer farmers couldn't care for their families and earn their own way. And they said that God was so upset that he was going to take the nation into captivity for their idolatry and their economic injustice. But then they said sometime the Messiah will come. And when the Messiah comes, every person, one of the prophets says, will sit under his own vine and fig tree. In other words, every person will have their land again. Now I get a basic paradigm for economic justice out of that. That is that God wants every person and family to have access to the productive resources so that if they act responsibly, they can earn their own way and be dignified members of their community. Let me second say a little bit about government, both the fact that it should be limited and also that it has an important role to play in terms of overcoming poverty and promoting economic justice. It's crucial, I think, from a biblical perspective to insist that government must be limited. There's a positive reason and a negative reason. The positive reason is that I think the Creator who made every person with the dignity that Robbie has so well expressed wants every person to be a shaper of history. If all the decisions are made by a few powerful people, then most of us are not able to fulfill our creation mandate. The negative reason is that, as Lord Acton said, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In a world where people are selfish, the biblical Christian word is sinful, if you have centralized, unchecked power, you're certainly going to get an abuse of that power, and it'll be used for the advantage of the people who wield it to the disadvantage of others. So limited government, it seems to me, is crucial. But that doesn't mean for a moment that I think that government has no role in overcoming poverty. I think a libertarian view is fundamentally contrary to a whole variety of things that the scriptures say. I would argue that there are many illustrations in the scripture where the government, in fact, is called to do justice and mishpat, and the words are mishpat and zedekah, to do justice and righteousness, and that includes promoting the kind of economic relationship where everybody has an opportunity to earn their own way. One of the provisions was that every 50 years there would be a jubilee. The land would go back to the original owners. Now, I don't think for a minute that what we should try to do is figure out who owned the land 50 years ago, but I think there's a principle there, namely that we want economic structures that make it possible for everybody to have access to the productive resources. The king is told, Solomon's told to do God's justice. There's a fascinating passage in Nehemiah chapter 5 where the ruler discovers that there's been, in a time of famine and great economic need, this is after the return from captivity, and in the southern kingdom of Judah, the wealthy Jewish people have have gotten the land of poor people who had to sell it in order to eat. Their children have gone into slavery, and the ruler calls an assembly, denounces the injustice, and says, give their land back right now and give back the interest that you've taken. There's a clear, powerful role for government to empower poor people, not just protect them, but make sure that they have access to the productive resources. So I don't think for a minute that a centrally planned and centrally owned economy is the way to go. I think that communism is not only contrary to biblical teaching about the dignity of each individual, but it also has been proven not to work very well, to put it mildly. But I don't think for a minute that means that there's no role for government. I think there's a major role for government in guaranteeing, for example, that everybody has access to health insurance, or to work toward a situation where if you work full-time responsibly, you get out of poverty. And we have millions of people in this country who, in fact, do that and work full-time responsibly and still don't get up to the poverty level. So that would be a beginning of what I would want to say on the topic.
May I, Brad, introduce a discussion of a principle that's very critical in my own tradition of Christian thought about economic justice and about political theory generally, and that's called the principle of subsidiarity. This is understood in the tradition as a principle of justice. This isn't just some sideline principle. It's central to justice. And here's what the principle of subsidiarity essentially is. It's the idea that problems should be solved at the lowest possible place in the social scale. That is, if a problem can be solved by an individual exercising his own initiative, let it be solved there. Don't rely on a higher unit of society to solve it for him. Let him take the initiative. Let him take charge of the thing. Let him use his own creative powers. Let him gain the benefit of doing it. If a problem can't be solved by an individual, let it be solved by the family. The family is not merely instrumentally valuable, as I mentioned earlier, but it does have important instrumental value as well as its intrinsic value in helping all the members of the family to be better off in all sorts of respects, including material respects. And it's only when a problem can't be solved at the familial level that we should move beyond the family, let's say, to institutions of civil society such as religious communities, such as civic associations, organizations like the Boy Scouts and the Campfire Girls, fraternal organizations, who may be able to step in and assist the family in solving the problem. Or if we don't want to put it in terms of problems, taking advantage of the opportunity, achieving the good, the benefit that's on offer, the common good for the members of the family that the family can't achieve on its own. And if we can't rely, because it's just beyond the capacity of those non-governmental institutions of civil society, then it's time to look to something more like government, but not necessarily the central government of the society. What about the local government? If the problem can be solved or the opportunity can be engaged and taken advantage of at the local governmental level, let it be solved there, close to the people whose lives will be affected. If it can't be solved there, and there's some problems that can't be solved there, then let it be solved at the regional or provincial level. But only if it can't be solved there do we shift all the way up to the central government and ask the central government to solve the problem. There are some problems, just think of in the United States. There's some issues, including some perennial issues like national defense, that at least in the contemporary world, we cannot solve on the familial level or the local community level. The institutions of civil society can't solve the problem, can't take care of national security. Neighborhoods can't. Even states can't. That's got to be done at the national level. So let it be done at the national level. But to shift up to the national level, something that can be handled at the local level, or to shift into the domain of government that which can be handled by non-governmental institutions, especially the family, is unjust because it's a usurpation of the authority of those smaller non-governmental institutions, those that are closest to the people, that know the names of the people who are to be protected or benefited, know them as individuals with their particular characteristics, their strengths and weaknesses, their needs and abilities, and so forth and so on. So I treat that as a very stringent principle of justice, one that I think is too often violated in the rush to solve the problem by turning it over to government or shifting it up to the absolutely highest level of government rather than letting it be solved and handled at the local level or preferably at the family level. One more point related to that is about the importance of those non-governmental institutions of civil society, churches, civic associations, fraternal organizations, people getting together on non-governmental basis in associations to help each other and to solve problems. The health and integrity of those entities is always placed at risk when government grows too big, or when we shift problems too far up into the central government, or when we permit government to suck away all the resources that would otherwise be available for the institutions of civil society to accomplish their very important tasks. These days, all too often, the institutions themselves are simply instrumentalized and placed in the service of, as if they were agencies of, the central government. And notice what happens when we do that. We remove something very important from a political point of view, very important from the limited government point of view. And Ron's absolutely right to stress the Christian significance of the idea of limited government. We remove that crucial buffer between the individual and the central state. Religion, civic associations, families themselves are crucial as buffers, as authority structures that are non-governmental, that aid and assist and guide the individual, and at the same time protect the individual from abuses, from the violations of liberty that may all too easily come where there is no buffer between the individual and the central state. In the most dramatic situations, you see, for example, the church in Poland, the Catholic Church in Poland. Brad very kindly mentioned the award that I got from the Polish government for work on human rights. Well, the Polish government knows something about human rights because of the experience with communism and the critical role that was played by the church. In the case of Poland, it happened to be the Catholic Church. This non-governmental institution of civil society that provided an authority structure, provided a way for the Polish people to organize, to retain their national identity, to retain their own integrity and will to fight, and ultimately, of course, enabled them to bring down the communist regime, leading, of course, to the collapse of communism more broadly in Europe. It began in Poland, and it's no accident that it began in Poland, because Poland was the one place where you had a functioning institution of civil society between the individual and the state.
I, almost entirely agree with what Robbie has just said. I think it's enormously important, and it is related to the whole issue of decentralizing power. One related comment is that when a problem needs to be dealt with at a higher level, governmental level, then it's crucial that government tries to do that in a way that doesn't undermine those other intermediate institutions. The way we did welfare for a long time in this country is certainly an illustration. In effect, we undermined the family with the welfare program, and that's simply fundamentally destructive, and we're still paying the price of that. Now, I have not read nearly as much about the Catholic principles of subsidiarity as Robbie has, but my understanding is that it works both ways, that not only do you do things at a lower level when you can, but, and you did say this, that there are times when they can only be dealt with at a higher level, even a national level, or in pretty strong papal statements about the need for a global political entity of some sort to deal with problems at a global level. Sometimes I think the Pope's statements on that go beyond what I would be wanting to say, just because I'm concerned about centralized power. So I think there are a bunch of places, I'll just mention a few, where we do need governmental level, even at the national level. Minimum wage, it seems to me that works better if we've got the national government legislating a fair minimum wage. Environmental regulation would obviously be another. And when it gets down to the concrete issues, we're really dealing with a question of prudence and debate. I mean, right now the issue of Obamacare and universal health insurance illustrates the whole debate. Is that too much centralized government power? Or is it a matter of justice? I would argue that it's a pro-life issue, that if human life is sacred, then in the richest nation in human history, everybody ought to have access to health insurance as a pro-life agenda, and that it doesn't dangerously centralize power in the federal government. But that's not a debate. And I'm sure probably we disagree on that policy, but that's not a debate between Robbie and me about whether or not every person has an inestimable value or whether we're concerned with the poor. It's a debate about whether this particular piece of legislation is too much centralized government or not, and does it tip the balance wrongly.
Yeah, Ron's made a very, very important point there. First, I want to say that I do agree that the principle of subsidiarity works in both directions, so that there can be an injustice as a result of government failing to move to step in where it should step in. Now, of course, even there we have to ask, well, at what level of government?
Sure.
Is there a constitutional basis? It's important for government to operate according to law. Lawless government, even when lawless government is aimed at doing good things, is a big problem. But the fundamental point is that the principle of subsidiarity does work both ways. You can have an injustice in either direction. I put the emphasis on the injustices that occur when higher levels usurp the authority and undermine the integrity of lower levels, for example, damaging the family through welfare programs, which Ron rightly pointed to. But it also does work the other way. You can have an injustice, as I say, where government needed to step in, should have stepped in, and failed to do it, and as a result, people were left in serious need or seriously harmed or damaged in one way or another. And then the point I wanted to emphasize that I think Ron is absolutely right about is the importance of prudence. Very often we agree on the principles. You get two Christians together, two people of other faiths, or general people of different faiths together, and they'll agree on the basic principle. They disagree on the prudential judgment about how to apply the principle. Will a particular proposed scheme of welfare result in the undermining of the family or the promotion of dependency, or will it not? In the case of any particular proposal on the table, policy proposal on the table, you're not going to find an answer to that in the Bible or in the teachings of the church fathers or in the teachings of bishops or religious leaders of any type. That's going to be a question that we have to do our best as citizens, doing our best as amateur political scientists or economists or sociologists to solve. And the work of policy analysts and economists and political scientists and sociologists is aimed often at helping people to make the best possible prudential judgments in that area. A lot of years of experience have proven to us that the experts are very often not very expert on these things. And the very best advice is given, it's taken, and we get a catastrophe. The law of unintended consequences takes over. No one intended welfare programs to create dependency. That wasn't the goal. No one intended welfare programs to undermine the family. That wasn't the goal. It wasn't as some sinister person said, we can undermine the family by enacting this kind of a welfare program. It was just a failure of foresight. I mean, recently we've had in the news this issue of the way in which government guaranteed student loans, many of you probably have them, have had the perverse effect of driving tuition costs and college costs up much higher, much faster than the general cost of living or inflation index. It was an unforeseen and perverse consequence. The program was meant to do good, make college available for more people who otherwise couldn't afford it. No one anticipated the perverse effect. Now, that is not an argument for doing nothing. We're saying that government should never be able to intervene or do anything because it's always going to mess things up. It's got a pretty good record of messing things up, but it's also done some things right, like winning World War II. Right? I mean, that was not done on private initiative. It was a government effort. So, we don't want to villainize government, but at the same time, we have enough experience now to proceed cautiously in this area and just do our best to make the wisest prudential judgments.
I would just add that sometimes that prudential judgment is related to very explicit, concrete data. In the question of whether or not raising the minimum wage X amount will really help or hurt poorer members of society is finally an economic question. It's not a moral question, and we have to have economists who disagree on that, and they do more careful work together.
That I think, Ron, really is it's an excellent example because there's some economists who say having a minimum wage at all hurts the very people that we should be trying to help. Some economists refer to minimum wage provisions as minority teenage unemployment acts. Now, you can't look up in the Bible whether those economists are right or wrong. And even among economists who think that a minimum wage is, on the whole, a good thing, there's considerable disagreement about where to peg the minimum wage. And of course, I think, Ron, you've just argued in favor of a national minimum wage. But a lot of people would say, no, that's a bad idea. We should have a minimum wage, but it shouldn't be the same thing in Topeka, the same level in Topeka, as it is in Los Angeles or New York because of differences of cost of living and so forth. That its economic effects or its effects on employment would be such that you really need some to account for variability there. So it shouldn't be handled, people here would say, who take that view would say, it shouldn't be handled at the national level. This is a case where federalism really does the job, because the circumstances are different in Kansas from what they are in Los Angeles, California, or New York. Let the minimum wage be established at the state level. Maybe
you might
with
very
some
well
national
argue
minimum.
that there ought to be a combination, that there ought to be a national minimum wage, but then states and cities can go above it. Yeah.
Well, I don't want this conversation to hinge on the question of prudence too much. It's an interesting and important topic, but so I'd like to return to the question of principle and to the actual moral teaching of Christ and of the Christian tradition and the way in which it relates to our modern understanding of politics and economics. Now, as you both know, there is in the Western world, a long-standing Christian socialist tradition going back at least to the mid-19th century and the Webbs, and which draws its own inspiration from the Book of Acts. And that tradition, in many ways, comes directly up to the present. I hate to draw on the unfortunate Hugo Chavez, former president of Venezuela, but he, if nothing else, was a committed socialist, and Hugo Chavez described Jesus as the greatest socialist in history. Just recently, Congressman Charlie Rangel from New York argued in favor of extending food stamps and Social Security on the grounds that this is what Jesus would do. In fact, even Republicans, Governor Bob Riley in Alabama, justified a few years ago raising taxes to extend welfare on the grounds, once again, that this is what all good Christians should do. So the question that I want to sort of reopen with you is, what is it in the teachings of Jesus or in the Christian tradition that contemporary socialists draw on for inspiration?
Well, it depends a lot on what you mean by socialism. If you mean centrally owned, centrally planned economies, then that kind of socialism, it seems to me, is obviously not efficient and wrong in terms of Christian principles. If you mean a significant amount of governmental intervention in the economic order to wisely empower poor people and reduce poverty, that's quite a different question. I don't use the word socialism. Western Europe sometimes uses socialism for that second definition. But let me say a couple more things about biblical principles that I think are relevant. One is probably the second most common theme in the Bible is that God has a special concern for the poor, and that God measures societies by what they do to the people at the bottom. So, I mean, that's a central kind of issue. I think, for example, that that relates kind of directly, rather directly, to the issue of whether or not we ought to slash food stamps right now. I mean, it's probably the second most important way that the federal government reduces poverty. There's been a study by the Department of Agriculture that discovered that 50% of the people who get food stamps stay on it for only 8 months. They need it temporarily, and then they go off. It's sufficiently run. There may very well be some corrections, modest corrections that we need to make, but it seems to me we shouldn't go about slashing that. That's the move from principle to specifics. One other kind of thing, I want to comment a little bit about the issue of equality. I agree with Robbie that I don't think biblical principles lead to a communist kind of understanding that we ought to have equality of income and equality of wealth. I think that there are good reasons for some inequality. Inventiveness, creativity, hard work ought to be rewarded. Laziness and irresponsibility and bad decisions ought to have a cost. So I think inequality of income and wealth is not inappropriate. My own view is that there are at least two criteria for saying when the inequality is too much. One is, I said that God wants every person and family to have access. Notice it's access, not handout. Access to the productive resources, to the capital. So if they act responsibly, they can earn their own way. When the inequality prevents a society from offering genuine access to all of its people, then it seems to me that inequality is too much. I would argue that the inequality today that we have in this country is at that point. The other principle is that I said power is dangerous, and centralized power is very dangerous. So if the inequality gets to a point where power is so centralized in a relatively small number of hands, then that's too much inequality. Again, I would argue that we've got that in this country. All you need to do is look at the way that a very small number of very wealthy people largely own both political parties, and you see how dangerously centralized power is. It annoys me when it doesn't amuse me that conservatives used to be very dead on in the 70s and 80s when they said that one of the major things that's wrong with Soviet communism is that it centralizes power. Now, I wouldn't argue that our present arrangement of huge corporations owned by relatively small numbers of people centralize power in the same way, but they certainly do centralize power, and it seems to me that conservatives tend to forget, some conservatives, not all of them, tend to forget about the current centralization of power that we have. In the last, from about 93 to 2007, about 50% of all the growth in income in this country went to the richest 1%. From 2003 to 2009, about 65% of all the growth in income went to the richest 1%. In the last couple of years, about 93% of all the increase in income in the whole country went to the richest 1%. Wealth and income are more centralized in our society today than at any time since just before the Great Depression in 1928. And I do think that we've got a dangerous inequality, economic inequality. But it's not because I think that the biblical norm or principle is absolute equality. I don't think that at all. It's because, one, it doesn't allow, it makes it more difficult for us to truly provide an economic equality of opportunity up to the point of being able to earn one's own way in a dignified way. And it centralizes power in dangerous ways.
Liberals tend to forget that in 2008, Wall Street and the wealthy, especially the billionaire class, gave considerably more money to Barack Obama's presidential campaign than to John McCain's. I think that's something that's not actually mysterious.
That it's what?
Not mysterious. Not mysterious. People seem to be baffled by it and startled by it when they hear it. I think big business has a stake in big government. I think big government works very well for big business. It doesn't work very well for small business. It doesn't work for Main Street as well as it works for Wall Street. There are a variety of ways in which the very wealthy have their interests served by liberal policies, including liberal economic policies, more than by conservative policies. On Christian socialism, it seems to me that Christian socialists first confuse principle with prudence and then get the prudence wrong. So they think that as a matter of principle, we need equality of income or wealth, or the socialization or government ownership of the means of production. They think that's a principle. Well, at best, that would be a prudential judgment about how best to give people access to economically decent lives. And of course, it doesn't even do that. The effort to make people equal always makes people equal in misery, except the very few people at the top who are more equal than others, who benefit from this egalitarian system. Something more like a principle than mere prudence is the principle of private property. Because, as Ron said, people should be rewarded for their initiative, for their willingness to take risks, for their responsible stewardship of what they've been given. You remember the parable Jesus tells of I think it's called the parable of the talents. Ron, correct me if I'm wrong on my scripture here. It's always good to have a Protestant around when you need scripture to be clarified. So the guy who actually...
I think it's Ephesians 10:15.
There you go. Now, of course, we shouldn't proof text in just this way. Thank goodness. But, there should be a reward for that. And as Ron said, there should be a cost for irresponsibility and for recklessness and for laziness and so forth. But it's also the case that private property is a way of making the resources of the world more productive to the benefit of everybody, and distributing the resources and the goods that are manufactured and made possible from the world's resources in a way that actually meets the wants and needs of people. Now, this is, again, is not an argument for laissez-faire, unrestricted, devil take the hindmost, the view attributed, I think, probably wrongly to Herbert Spencer of social Darwinism. This is not a social Darwinist view. It's just a mistake to suppose that that there's no sensible position between socialism and social Darwinism. Most Christians for most of history and most Christians today fall into neither camp. And where they are on the spectrum really is determined by their prudential judgments about what the effects actually will be of this proposed welfare problem, that proposed minimum wage, or the question of whether to have the minimum wage at all, how we're going to handle health care. The question of how to make health care more accessible for more people is a complicated one. It's not obvious that the answer to that has much to do with government running or mandating much of anything. It could be that market mechanisms, if intelligently designed, would make the cost of medicine lower and within the range of people who are now excluded, basically because medical costs, like college costs, and for very similar reasons having to do with government policies, have risen far more quickly than the general price, the cost of living, or the inflation indexed. So again, I mean, it's a question of what your prudential judgment is about these things, but that there should be a scheme of private property as opposed to a socialized system for the ownership of the means of production, or an effort to make everybody equal. I think that we can say really is a Christian principle, that private property is a Christian principle. If we do away with private property, we're doing a fundamental injustice. We'd be doing something else, I think, that would be very bad, and that is eliminating the possibility of social mobility and locking ourselves into a class system. One of the great things about the market economy, and again, please, by the market economy, I don't mean social Darwinism, but one of the great things about the market economy, and it's one of the things that's made this nation a very great nation, is social mobility. The market economy is what makes social mobility possible. I regret, as I'm sure Ron does, the diminution in recent years of social mobility. It's more difficult than it was in my father's generation to rise from a lower socioeconomic level to a higher one. And I think we need to ask ourselves this question very seriously and soberly. Why is that the case, and what can be done about it? And we have had a rise in poverty. There's no way around that. There are more people on welfare today and more people in poverty today than there were only a few years ago. Does that mean that we need a government program? Does that mean that the government has to rush in, or that government programs are the answer? No, not necessarily. Again, we've got a very important prudential judgment to make about how we're going to create circumstances in which people are able to work and can keep the benefits, reap the benefits of their work. And if they're lower down on the socioeconomic scale, to rise up through education, through hard work, through initiative, and so forth.
A couple comments that fall in the prudence, prudential judgment area. One is with regard to social mobility. It's now the case that there's less social mobility in the U.S., in spite of our great history on this, than in Western Europe. And it's certainly not the case that there's less governmental intervention in the economy there than here. The second comment has to do with healthcare, and I think the suggestion, Robbie, that you think that further privatization there, rather than government intervention, would be more efficient. as I understand it, and I think it's just generally agreed, that we spend far more per person on healthcare than any other industrialized nation. Canada and other countries that have more government intervention, in fact, government intervention that guarantees that everybody has health insurance, spend a lot less per person on healthcare than we do. The third comment is to ask a question. Would we agree or wouldn't we with this principle that if somebody in this society works full-time responsibly, they ought to get well out of poverty, I'd say 25% above the poverty level, just as a kind of, we can argue about that specific amount, but significantly out of poverty and have access to health insurance. Is that a principle that we would both agree on?
It's a goal that we would both agree on. And of course, the reason we would agree on the goal is we share some principles about the fundamental dignity of the human being and so forth. Now, how to get to that goal would, of course, require prudential judgment. Now, of course, these Western European countries, in many cases, are actually liberalizing their economy as we are moving more in the direction of central planning and control. So I don't think we can move very swiftly to the conclusion that to get greater social mobility, we can tolerate or should even invite greater governmental command and control.
Well, I would argue that cutting Pell Grants, which is a major proposal on the table in the House currently, that certainly would reduce government expenditures. In that sense, less centralization. But it seems to me that's a good measure for empowering kids from poor families.
It very well might be the best, I don't know. But I'd want to look at what the alternatives are. And I would want to see if there is some alternative that doesn't require the intervention of the central government. I'd also want to look at whether there are any perverse side effects in driving up the cost of education and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I'm always open to that debate.
I think moving too quickly to the idea that there should be, that we're now in that domain where it's the central government's job to do it, has not served us well really since the New Deal. One more point on healthcare. I think we probably made a mistake creating, by government policies and incentivization, a situation in which for ordinary visits, doctor visits, ordinary health care, not the catastrophic situations, but ordinary health care, people are not paying for their own health care. Somebody else is paying. So the true cost of the health care is hidden. I think the perverse effects of that probably has been to drive up the cost of health care, creating part of the problem that we have today. So I don't think things were anything like ideal before the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, which is itself, of course, not turning out very well. But things weren't perfect. We needed reforms, but I think those reforms should have included a revisiting of a system that did shield people from the knowledge of what their health care was costing. Now, catastrophic care, I think, is creates a different issue.
Right. If I could interrupt now, gentlemen, and I'd like to turn the floor over now to Bruce Yandel and Ben White. And Bruce, why don't we start with you?
Thanks very much, and thank you for a very stimulating conversation. A number of years ago, when George W. Bush occupied the White House, Kevin Phillips penned a book, American Theocracy. Phillips argued that a radical form of Christianity had become central to the development of U.S. policy, that, as he put it, Taliban-like positions were being openly advocated by people in power. Many viewed this as a tug away from socialism, an intervention at a higher level. Others saw it as a more profound form of intervention by the central government. And so here's the question. Would Jesus, or should people following Jesus' promptings, support a Christian theocracy?
Well, the first thing I want to say about what you reported about Kevin Phillips is this. I serve as chairman now of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and our charge under the International Religious Freedom Act passed in the 1990s, creating our commission, is to examine violations of religious freedom around the country and abuses, and especially the persecution of people based on religion at countries around the world. And of course that means we've looked closely at places like North Korea and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and Afghanistan. Anyone who has listened, as I have done, to those who have suffered persecution under the Taliban would be appalled that an American pundit like Kevin Phillips would compare the advocacy of any Americans, no matter how much he happened to disagree with their beliefs, appalled that he would equate them with the activities of the Taliban. The Taliban murder people. They cut off their body parts. They destroy their homes. It is a horrible phenomenon, and when in power, a horrible regime. So, yes, that's a theocracy. Is the United States of America anywhere close to being that? Absolutely not. Is there anybody in the United States of America participating in any meaningful sense in our national debate who is like the Taliban? No. People like me who are conservatives shouldn't go around accusing liberals, including secular liberals, of being Stalinists or communists. But those on the liberal side, where Kevin Phillips has now shifted himself, should not go around calling people who disagree with them fascists or Nazis or Taliban. It accomplishes nothing. It undermines the circumstances of civil debate on which democracy itself depends. So I would say to Brother Phillips, cool it.
I totally agree with Robbie, and would add that the First Amendment simply doesn't mean that religious people are not supposed to say what they think about public policy. And furthermore, it's simply the case, even John Rawls admits it now, that everybody starts his or her basic political thinking, whether consciously or not, with some set of normative principles about the understanding of who persons are and justice and so on, start with their deepest religious or philosophical commitments. So what we need to say to take the First Amendment seriously and our democracy seriously is to say everybody in this culture, Muslims, Jews, Christians, whether they're liberals or conservative Christians, atheists, and everybody are invited to articulate what they think would be good public policy coming out of their deepest philosophical religious views, and then let the democratic process decide what, at a given moment, the country will do. But that's not a theocracy when Christians do that.
Yeah, Professor Gandel, it seems to me, I completely agree with Ron on this one, it would be contrary not only to our First Amendment, which actually protects the right of religious people to enter the public square, but to our national history, to suppose that people have to leave their religious faith at the door when they enter the public square to act as citizens. No, on the contrary. The abolitionists, the leaders of and many people in the civil rights movement, those who fought for, and many of them were the same people, fighting for votes for women and also for prohibition. Those who fought against exploitation of children and women workers in the early 20th century. All of them were people who were inspired by their religious convictions. They brought their religiously inspired beliefs about justice and the common good to the public square to advocate their position to their fellow citizens. I mean, imagine telling Dr. King or his principal allies, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Reverend Hosea, they're all Reverend, right? Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Reverend Hosea Williams said, well, now look, it's okay to be in favor of civil rights, but you got to leave religion out of it. Imagine their reaction. They'd be just absolutely baffled. I mean, the whole point of their advocacy, the whole motivation was their Christian belief in the universal brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God, traceable to the prophets, all the way back to Genesis 1, to the idea of man made in the image and likeness of God, irrespective of race or ethnicity or what have you.
Professor White.
Thank you both for an engaging conversation. I'd like to pick up on something that's come out as a theme now several times in your remarks, Dr. George, and I want to hear both of your sort of comments on this issue. Part of your argument about individual human dignity, worth, and rights comes from your reading of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, and that man and women are made in the image of God. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul argues that Christians are not just made in the image of God, but are being transformed into the image of Christ. And he normally makes this point in the context of trying to encourage Christians to sacrifice their freedoms and rights for the benefits of others in the community, much like Jesus did. At least this is the way that Christian interpretations of the significance of the crucifixion of Jesus under Pontius Pilate have gone. I'd like to hear both of you discuss how you think that one of the central events of the Christian story, the crucifixion, should factor in the way that Christians think about economics and justice.
Of course, the story of the crucifixion is, among many other things, a story of self-sacrifice. Christ freely accepts his redemptive role. He experiences it and acts on it as his vocation. One of the messages, it seems to me, is that all of us are required as Christians, those of us who are Christians, to model, to exemplify that self-sacrificial love, to be Christ-like. What else could it mean to be Christ-like? It's not just kind of being a nice guy. It's to model that self-sacrificial love, and that means giving of our substance. Do you remember in the gospel, there's the story of Jesus being approached by a rich young man. Some translations call him a rich young ruler. And I picture him in my mind's eye, resplendent in his fancy clothing, probably an entire retinue with him, camels, dromedaries, servants. And do you remember what his question was for Jesus? He says, "Good master, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus first says, and you'll have to explain this one to me, Professor. Before he answers the question, he says, "Why do you call me good? God alone is good," which has often made me wonder, Ron, whether what we're being taught there is that this rich young man has already got implicitly the insight that Jesus is in fact God, that he's in fact the Son of God. Now, this is not the Jesus we all know. This is Jesus, the holy man, the itinerant preacher, being encountered by a member of his community, a particularly affluent and privileged member of his community. But in any event, whatever that means, that question, "Why do you call me good?" Jesus doesn't wait for his answer. He just moves right on and gives his answer. And what's the answer? He says, "Well, you know what the commandments are. Don't steal, don't kill, don't commit adultery, honor your father and your mother." And the rich young man says to him, "Master, I have observed and followed these from my youth." Now there, at least if you're as bad a Christian as I am, you really feel convicted, because can you imagine looking Jesus in the eye? And we have no reason to think the young man's lying, and saying to him, "Yep, I have kept the commandments from my youth." I wish I could say that. But here he was. And imagine how the rich young man must have felt. He must have just wanted to kind of do the pump, right? I'm there. I ask Jesus, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? He says, you know the commandments. Don't steal, don't kill, don't commit adultery, honor your father and your mother. I've done it. That's what I've been doing. I'm golden. Then what does the gospel writer tell us? I think it's Mark. It says, then Jesus looked at him with love. Jesus looked at him with love. He's about to lower the boom on the guy. But looked at him with love. And we can only think, it seems to me, Ron, that Jesus is going to do this because he loves him, and because he loves him, he wants him to be not only good, but perfect. Perfect in the sense that you were describing from St. Paul. Jesus says to him, then there's one more thing you must do. Go, sell what you have, and give the money to the poor, then come and follow me. And then what are we told? We're told the young man went away sad. He turned away, went away sad, for he had many possessions. What's Jesus telling us? The Christian life is hard. Even this pious, morally virtuous, rich young man couldn't live up to the demands of the Christian life. Now, is that because all of us are called to give away our material possessions? No. That's a mistake to read it that way. Some of us are not called to give up all of us are called to be charitable. Not all of us are called to spend ourselves into poverty with our charity, no. I think by many possessions, what we're being told there is all of us have some things that are so precious to us that we don't want to give them up, even to follow Christ. It might be status, it might be reputation. It might be that we're called to advocate some great, though very unpopular cause. Defense of marriage, protection of innocent human life, that could subject us to ridicule, that could impede our advancement in our careers, could cost us a job in the academic world or someplace else, could damage our social standing, make us seem unsophisticated or whatever. And yet, Jesus says you got to give it up. You need to be willing to sacrifice yourself in order to follow me. But there's always a beneficiary of it. None of these causes, whether it's material goods or public advocacy or a call to the contemplative life in a monastery or in a convent, none of them are just abstractions. We're being called to do something for the benefit of our fellow human beings. Even the sister, the contemplative nun who prays, isn't in a convent and never sees another human being outside the convent. She's not just kind of there individualistically to develop her own spiritual life. She's there so that her prayers can be fruitful for the benefit of others, and a fortiori for the advocate of a cause, even an unpopular cause, or for the person who is called to give away material possessions. And I think finally this, to answer your question, I think your question suggests the importance of not reading even the commands of generosity in the Bible as pertaining to government, or exclusively to government. Government has a role, I agree with Ron on this. But the fundamental call of charity is a call to us as individuals and to us as families to give, even materially, out of our substance. We shouldn't be, even if we're wealthy, just thinking that care for the poor means paying my taxes so that there can be welfare and health care and government-administered programs for education grants and so forth and so on. It's a call on each of us, and not just on our money, but in our relationship with people who are poor. Now, many of us go through our lives not encountering, in the sense of physical proximity, poor people. But many of us do. How do we treat them? How do we treat them? Do we give of our substance? Do we give of ourselves beyond our money? You mentioned I had the high honor of representing Mother Teresa of Calcutta. She would have been the first to tell you, yes, I need your money. Please be charitable to the Missionaries of Charity. We do good work all over the world. But you know what? We need you. We need your time. We need you to reach out to the poor yourselves. If not with us, at least in your communities. Just final point. Jim Toohey, who was he's a Democrat, Ron, was but although being a Democrat, was the second director of the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives under President Bush. She's a wonderful guy. He's now the president of Ave Maria University down in Naples, Florida. Well, he tells the story of going to visit Mother Teresa at one of her homes where she cared for very, very poor people in India. He made the trip to India. He was there. And he went into the place, and of course it was in many ways horrible. The smell was not pleasant. There were people who were, with open sores on their bodies. The sisters were doing their best on the resources they had, but it didn't look like the kind of hospital that anybody in this room might be cared for in. It was kind of a nasty situation, but he wanted to see it, and he wanted to meet Mother Teresa, and he brought a check. And he gave Mother Teresa the check as a gift. And she said, "Thank you," and then handed him a stack of wet cloths and said, "Put the cloths on the heads, on the foreheads of those people over there in the beds." And Jim says, the repugnance was so strong against my touching these people and doing this that only one thing overcame it, and that was that I was too ashamed not to do it. I didn't do it because I wanted to or because it was the Christian thing to do. I was ashamed when Mother had given me these cloths not to do it, and so I did it. Mother Teresa here, I think, is sending a lesson to all of us about what self-sacrificial love means, and the radical, crazy demand that Christianity makes on anybody who's crazy enough to say, "I want to be a disciple of Christ."
I would just say, with regard to the story of the rich young man, ruler, that I think Robbie's right that one should not conclude from that everybody's supposed to give away all their wealth. I think that the problem was that wealth was his idol. He was in effect worshiping wealth, and Jesus says, whatever your idol is, you have to give it up. I would add that I think an awful lot of American folk, including American Christians, do worship the same idol, and they probably ought to model what Jesus suggested to the rich young ruler more than they do. The other comment is, it was an interesting question that I hadn't thought about much. What does the cross have to do with this? And I think one needs to be careful. Certainly, one of the first things one wants to say about the cross is that the Trinity is present, somehow mysteriously and wondrously reconciling God's holiness and God's love. But Paul says an interesting thing with regard, when he's talking about the offering that he's taking up, he spent a lot of time taking up an intercontinental offering among people in Greece for Asian Christians back in Jerusalem. And he talks about Christ sacrificing himself as part of the model for Christians, being sacrificial in their giving for this intercontinental offering. So I suppose that's one point where we would appropriately think about Jesus' self-giving in his whole life, first of all in the incarnation, then in the cross, is relevant to our topic.
Well, I have a confession of guilt. I asked our two questioners to put together a whole series of questions, and this conversation has gone so well and fluidly that we are fast approaching the end of our time, and we haven't given the audience yet an opportunity to ask questions. So my apologies Dr. Yandel and White, to you, but I would now ask and encourage those of you who'd like to ask questions. We've got microphones here in the front, and I would just like to remind you, please, just remember, we are being live streamed, and therefore we would ask that you not make statements, but rather ask a question.
Professor George, here's a what would Jesus do question.
What would Jesus do?
What would Jesus do question. What would Jesus do regarding the growing discrepancy between the haves and have-nots in this country? If something, what? If nothing, why not?
Okay. Really the question what would Jesus have us to do? And it seems to me that what Jesus would have us to do is make the very best judgments we can make based on the best evidence and best information we can to reestablish the circumstances of social mobility that would enable people who are willing to work hard and be creative and take initiative to benefit materially from their efforts. Something, and people debate what it is, and it might be more than one thing, has significantly impeded the ability of Americans to rise from lower socioeconomic circumstances to higher circumstances. The competing political parties have different ideas about how to defeat that impediment or those impediments. All any of us can do, even if we share the same goals, which we should, which is to overcome that impediment or those impediments, is to do our best to see what would work. A lot of Democrats think governmental intervention or governmental programs or social welfare programs are the key. A lot of Republicans think that economic growth through the liberalization of the market, unleashing the power of competition and of the market, is the way to go. It could be some combination. We can't rule out in advance that it's some combination of those things. But if so, we have to ask ourselves, well then, what is the right combination? We know that a lot of what we have tried has failed. And what do they say the definition of insanity is? To keep doing what you have been doing even though it's not working. We're 2 years away from less than 2 years away from 2015. That will be the 50th anniversary of Lyndon Johnson launching his war on poverty and the Great Society centrally government-led initiatives to fight poverty, to destroy poverty. It was going to be, as I said, a war on poverty. And the 50th anniversary of the Moynihan Report. The students in the room won't have any idea of what I'm talking about, but I suspect you do, sir. And those of us of a certain age know what that report was. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who went on to become a very distinguished United States Senator, a liberal Democrat, served from New York, senator from New York. In 1965 was a young, brilliant Harvard sociologist working for a liberal Democratic administration, the Johnson administration, about to launch its war on poverty. Moynihan had a look at the data, ran some numbers, and was shocked, and rang the alarm bell for the whole country in a report called the Report on the Negro Family. We now know it as the Moynihan Report. Because what he learned was that 25% of births to African American women were out of wedlock. In the height of the Depression, in the era of Jim Crow, that figure had been much, much lower. In fact, not significantly different from the majority population. But when Moynihan saw that it was 25%, He said something has to be done. He rang the alarm because he said, you know where this will lead? It will lead, of course, to fatherlessness. It'll lead to despair, delinquency, drug abuse, violence, crime, incarceration, in a vicious cycle. Now, some people called him a racist. Liberal Democrat working for the Johnson administration, which had not only was launching its war on poverty, but it also, taken the big lead in the Civil Rights Act, enacted new civil rights legislation. But they called him a racist. They accused him of blaming the victim. The net result was his warning wasn't really heeded. The problem was not taken seriously. So fast forward now to 2013. Everything Johnson predicted came true. Devastating effects. Not on rich people, not on affluent people. No, you know who bore the burden? Poor people. Minorities. And not just minorities, because now we see what Moynihan saw in places like Detroit and inner city Philadelphia. We now see in the Rust Belt, the old Rust Belt cities, the old industrial cities, or my native Appalachia. I come from West Virginia. It's just in West Virginia, the drug is different. Instead of crack cocaine, it's methamphetamine. Same destructive consequences for people's lives. But what do we see? We see the out-of-wedlock birth rate in the African American community over 70%. Was 25% when he was ringing the alarm bell. And for the general population, in 1965, when Moynihan issued his report, it was 5%. Today it's over 40%. And the latest data I've seen show that for women in peak childbearing years, 18 to 35, it's even higher, well up into the 40s, approaching 50%. The consequences of this for poverty are tremendous. Moynihan saw it, now we have the data, now we know. We should have taken him seriously back then. The most important thing we can do in this country to fight poverty, it seems to me. It's not the only thing we need to do. We need to work on these economic issues. We need to work on employment, making employment more available to people. We need to revivify this economy. We do need economic growth because of its employment consequences, among other things. But even more fundamentally, the most important thing we can do to fight poverty is to rebuild a vibrant marriage culture so that people in Appalachia and in the industrial cities and in the inner cities will have the poverty-fighting benefit of family life. I don't know, Ron, what do you think about it?
I think you're absolutely right in spades. I couldn't agree more. I'm passionate about that. And to this day, it's the case that there are liberal circles where they simply refuse to admit the overwhelming sociological data that it's better for kids, other things being equal, to grow up with both of their biological parents. So if I had to list 4 or 5 things that I most would like to do in this society, if I could, one of them would be to renew wholesome two-parent families. I think it's absolutely crucial for all kinds of things, but certainly for reducing poverty. I do think that it's also true that economic pressures on low-income people do also increase the likelihood of divorce. So there are economic factors that go in as well, but the marriage issue is overwhelmingly important.
Well, I know our speakers have been mesmerizing, but we typically have people standing 4 or 5 deep at the microphones at this point. So please don't feel intimidated. We would love to have a couple more questions, particularly from students or anyone.
Can I just say it from here?
Let's come down to the microphones.
There's one right here.
Yes, I have a question. How would you both assess the current state of Christians dealing with freedom? Would you say, I'm sorry,
Louder.
yeah, I'll talk louder. How would you say Christians are doing now in our modern times at following the principles of Jesus? Are they getting it wrong? Are they doing a good job? What would you suggest they keep in mind going forward for both of these failings and trying to go policy?
We're doing badly as Christians have always done badly. My dear friend Cornell West, with whom I teach at Princeton, who's also a very dear friend of mine, says that being a Christian means falling and getting up, and falling again and getting up again, knowing that you're going to fall again. I think it was Nietzsche who said there has only been one Christian and he died on a cross. Now, I actually think that's wrong, because what Nietzsche failed to see is that Christianity is not a church for saints. It's a church for sinners who want to be saints. And as Cornell says, we keep falling and getting up and falling and getting up. And the great thing from a Christian point of view is, as bad as we are, Jesus will forgive us. Salvation is still available because Jesus didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance.
I would just add that I think to a large extent in this society in the last 30, 40, 50 years, Christians have been either left-wing or right-wing folk in terms of politics, and they haven't listened to the whole biblical agenda. I like to say if you're going to be a Christian in politics, you ought to ask, what does the Bible say God cares about? It looks like he cares about the sanctity of human life and economic justice, the family and creation care, sexual integrity and freedom and peacemaking. And so it seems to me we ought to be concerned with all of those things. And to a large extent, Christians have simply fallen into one-sided political agendas, and even worse, they have contributed to the lack of civil dialogue. It seems to me the church ought to be the place where we can model real discussion across differences and figure out how to make some progress in this society. We desperately need it.
Yeah, the deadly sins have not gone away. You know, we're all vulnerable to all of them. You know, it's the human condition, what Christians call original sin. We are fallen creatures. And of course, there are circumstances of particular societies will make certain sins easier or make certain sins more attractive. And as Pope John Paul II taught, one of the problems to be put on one side of the balance against the many benefits of our materially prosperous society, unknown in all of human history, you know, one of the downsides is the temptation to love things, love toys, love possessions. You know, it's not, there has always been greed, but the particular manifestation it takes in a society like ours is what the Pope called consumerism. So that the spiritual now is kind of squeezed out, and we seek, if not salvation, we seek our sense of being important by whether we drive a Lexus or our kid went to Yale. And that's, we should face squarely that in the society in which we find ourselves today as Christians, those are specially alluring temptations. So we have to be specially on our guard against those. And if I'm right about that, the message to pastors is, you've got to be specially exercising leadership in warning people about the particular dangers that we have here and now, which might have been different from the dangers other people in other cultures have or had. Although in any culture, the dangers are going to be very dangerous. You know, your soul's in peril no matter where you are.
Let's go to this side, please.
Thank you, Professors Sider and George. My question concerns whether...
Into the mic. Yeah, there you go.
My question concerns whether private or public institutions better alleviate poverty, specifically after the implementation of old age insurance and Social Security. Before, seniors were among the highest poverty groups, afterward the lowest. Are there instances where private institutions have been able to successfully alleviate poverty in the same sense?
Yeah.
In the same state?
We don't know the answer to that question. We can't assume that because one system had some good effects as well as some bad effects, that it's the superior system. We need to know what the alternatives are. And of course, there are lots of proposals out there for alternatives to our current Social Security system, which does not function the way Franklin Roosevelt sold it to people as functioning. My father to this day believes there really is a lockbox, and all that money that he's been contributing over the years is in the lockbox. And he thinks he's only going to get out what he put in. Okay? Now, look at Chile. Chile's got a very different system, one that has worked extremely well, at least so far, but one that really does rely on individual savings with less governmental involvement in the system than the one we have in the United States. So here we have a classic case of the need for prudential judgment. There's no answer to the question, what's the truly Christian Social Security system? We can't get that out of the Bible or the teaching of the Church Fathers or the teaching of the tradition or anything like that. It's really a question that requires our thinking about the economics and sociology of the matter, not so much the theology of the matter. Theology will give us the goal. We don't want elderly people living in poverty and misery. Now, how best to get to the goal without creating the situation we now have with Social Security, which is even worse with Medicare, that other big middle-class entitlement system, which is the prospect of bankruptcy with all the consequences that has for everybody in the society, and again, especially those who are the least well off.
I am being given the signal that our time is fast coming to an end, and we're going to get kicked out of the auditorium here shortly. I think we have time for one quick question back onto this side. Those of you who have been waiting at the microphone and won't get the opportunity to ask your question, you can be first in line after we're done to come up to the front and speak privately with Professors George and Sider. Please.
Yes, my question is sort of two-pronged. I suppose you both have talked a lot about the need for the family unit and how that is probably the best thing that we as Christians and politicians in general could emphasize to lift our country out of poverty and alleviate poverty. And I'm just curious, with the controversial issue of marriage and the Defense of Marriage Act and things like that, sort of the two-prong is, one, what should we as Christians do? You know, what do you each believe Jesus would say our role should be? And two, what, if any, do you think the role of government should be in that?
In strengthening marriage?
Yes, sir.
Well, the first thing to say is that the primary responsibility and the primary place where we can make progress in strengthening marriage is not government. It's our religious institutions. You know, unless our pastors teach and preach effectively and help our congregations, in fact, keep our marriage vows for life, we're simply not going to make it. Now, there are some things that government can do. We could change no-fault divorce. We could make it harder for couples who have underage children to get divorced. There are a whole variety of things that government can do, but that's not the primary place where we're going to solve this problem.
This will show you how unlibertarian I actually am. I think it would be well, maybe even you on this issue would be unlibertarian, Brad. I think it would be a catastrophe for the government to get out of the marriage business. Often this is suggested as the solution to our debate over the definition of marriage. Get the government out of the marriage business. That's not the way to go. There are two ways you can abolish marriage. One is simply to get the government out of the marriage business. So at least as a legal category, government is abolished. The other is to redefine it as something other than a conjugal partnership. Well, what could that be? Well, exactly what marriage has been reduced to in much of our society, and that's the idea that marriage is sexual, romantic, domestic partnership, a form of companionship. Not what it has historically been, which is the bond that unites a man and woman as husband and wife, to be father and mother to any children born of that union, giving to those children the inestimable benefit of being brought up in the bond of the parents whose union gave them life, connected to them in that biological as well as emotional, Christians would say spiritual way, giving them that biological as well as emotional and spiritual connection. The same-sex marriage question only arose very late. Why did it arise? Something that would have been considered just conceptually impossible 30 years ago, because marriage had already been reduced in the popular culture, quite apart from same-sex anything, to romantic partnership, to a form of sexual romantic companionship. What caused that was the sexual revolution of the 1960s, the widespread normalization of out-of-wedlock childbearing, the equally widespread normalization of sexual cohabitation without the benefit of marriage, the phenomenon of promiscuity, even more broadly, the mainstreaming by Hugh Hefner in the 1950s of so-called softcore pornography, the collapse of the traditional sexual ethic produced, really, manifested in a way, the collapse of the traditional understanding of what marriage actually was, and that is a conjugal partnership with the goals that I just outlined. So it's not that same-sex relations or same-sex partnerships is the cause of the marriage problem. It's simply a manifestation of the underlying change in people's understanding of what marriage actually is, which, to put it that way, is even, actually not to put it correctly, the abolition of the idea of marriage and its replacement with a new idea for organizing human relationships, the idea of sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, to which the label marriage is then reassigned.
Again, I agree completely.
Well, somehow I suspect with this last question, we could probably open up a whole new can of worms and be here for another 4 or 5 hours.
I can save the bother, because just have a look at my book, What is Marriage? Man and Woman in Defense, which I wrote with two brilliant former students, Sharif Girgis and Ryan Anderson.
Yeah.
I wanted to pause for a commercial advertisement.
And I suspect this audience, which is the saving remnant, the true and the brave who have stuck it out, probably could stay another 4 or 5 hours. But we really do have to end this wonderful conversation. And I'd like to thank Professor Sider and George for really a fabulous conversation on a very important topic. And my hope, of course, is that this conversation will not end here tonight, but rather will continue on the campus at Clemson University and, in fact, continue with Americans all across this country. And so I'd like to ask you all, please, to join me in thanking our two speakers.
Thank you, Brad.